Exodus is a farce, probably a subversion of a farce, kind of in the tradition of Dario Fo, the Italian playwright, and maybe Joe Orton. Those were big influences on me. Subvert the genre of farce to explore like contemporary politics, particularly British immigration and asylum policy, maybe more specifically how the tragedies of asylum seekers are being utilized to consolidate political power in this particular moment in time, and the kind of cynicism of that. I think in 2015, that was the year that you started noticing like a lot of the imagery around migration. The migration crisis was in the news cycle almost constantly, and there was just images constantly pouring in. I remember just being on the train a lot around here in Glasgow, and the metro would just be covered with images of people, and David Cameron had referred to these people as a swarm, and there was like the life jackets, the boats, and there was something I felt there was something that shifted in the way that we perceived people, the threat level being played up, which you could see has led to certain very momentous political decisions being made, and so and I think that there was something, the idea sprung into my head of the kind of biblical image of Moses, the baby in the bulrushes, and that story being in the coast. But I also had this more cynical question of genuinely, if the right of the Tory party politicians were in power and they were doing some PR on the Dover coast, and this baby washed ashore that would threaten their narrative, what would they do with it? And there were a few scary moments quite early on when knowing this play was going into production, and Priti Patel announced this Rwanda plan, and where you've written something and the reality is rapidly catching up with your cynicism, and so juggling and negotiating that, but the essence of what happens, and I suppose what happens in these political situations is, people, the dehumanization of another person, and being able to do that, and that process of that psychological and political process probably has its own timelessness. So I wanted to try, and I think there's a bit in our culture of being the fear of being too on the nose, but we can't. Sometimes you just have to address what's going on directly. And don't know. I would disagree that there is always a problematic to be on the nose. So I'd initially started writing sketches for this show in 2018. I think this around the start of 2019, the National Theatre Scotland put out they do a series of residencies called starter residencies, and they put a female political comedy writing one, which I was very daunted to apply for, and in fact had applied for another one, and one of the staff members said you should definitely apply for the political comedy one. You could kind of choose and shape how the residency could best fit your practice. And I asked for a bit of dramaturgy, so Rosie Kelliger spent quite a bit of time, just a series of kind of deadlines for me to get through to a full draft of the play. And Rosie has read countless drafts of this play, which is quite a feat of endurance. But and so that was incredibly helpful. And then at the end of the process with that residency, NTS decided to commission the play, and that was delightful. And then this was all during COVID time, and toward the end of during that commissioning period, they decided they wanted to go ahead and produce it, which was a huge shock. I was like, are you sure? But so I was just so delighted, and it's been a great process. So so it's kind of like having an idea and realizing the idea is something that you want to write. And then I think, for me, I always think there's a time that you have to get right when you have to write the play. So it's like you have the idea, you identify to yourself, this is an idea that I'm going to write, and then you have to get the timing right of like when you actually do it, because if you do it too early, you're just scraping for it, and if you do it too late, it becomes quite stale, so you've got to find the time in your schedule to just go and write the play. And so, but the gestation period is important, the kind of carrying it about with you and starting to be a weirdo and talk to yourself and chatting to your pals and writing things on your hand randomly, and they're like, oh, what's wrong with you? Trying to be a playwright. Yeah, Debbie became attached to the project, and I knew Debbie from the Traverse Young Writers Group 14 years ago when we were kind of spotty kids. And we were both in the same Young Writers Group at the Trav. And yeah, so she came aboard, and yeah, the rehearsal process started in July. The Tory Leadership Contest was announced in like the first week of rehearsals. And interesting, moving into the rehearsal period, everything becomes practical, and so it's like what works and what doesn't. So that was an interesting decision. I feel like with comedy, like you can write beautiful things, but does it work and does it land? And so it becomes very important with the director. If Debbie knows if the beats are going on too long, then she's right and I'm wrong, and the beautiful sentence must go. And the realization that it's going to be on in front of people is like, maybe it sounds obvious, but you don't think about that really when you're just writing on spec for yourself. Someone once said to me, like putting a play on is always a traumatic process, and regardless of if it's great or if it's terrible, it's like there's just like it's just a bit of traumatic experience. And I think it's a good way to look at it. I mean, it's what you do, it's what you love doing, and I love the collaborative aspect of it is amazing, and seeing an audience come in and if for some people to resonate with it is what you do it for and what drives you, but it's also terrifying and horrific and like a mix of things. Farce felt like it reflected the pace of what was going on in contemporary politics at the moment. And I think when you think of like the Basil Fawlty character, there's this like strong drive, a singular drive to do something. In this case, in Exodus, it's like to save face. And at all costs, at what cost will we, to succeed, to obtain political power? And so that was really compelling, because there's no complication. Nothing will make these characters are so much like some of contemporary politicians. It's just the aim to stay in power is so undiluted. Anything that gets in its way will be solved by whatever means necessary. And so that's quite compelling, and I felt like that was an interesting thing to play with. It was Joe Farrell, academic. He was one of the translators for Dario Fo, and he wrote an essay called The Politics of Farce, which was really influential for me writing this play. So through him, I learned quite a lot about Dario Fo's thoughts, and he had this idea that laughter can be cathartic, or laughter can also consolidate rage at injustice, and that it doesn't need to be, those things don't need to be mutually exclusive. So I hope that people that people that feel that the moment that we're living in is, we could do better as a body politic, feel galvanized and feel some shred of optimism and also rage. The theatricality of politics is probably a big theme. I guess sometimes you think it's so rare these days that you hear a politician speaking, and the ones that do, when you hear a politician speaking and meaning what they say, and you genuinely feel like, oh, this person is expressing their genuine views, like the rarity of that in this particular landscape is quite saddening. And I think there's this kind of the showmanship of the whole political landscape was a big theme. Because they're all female identifying characters, it was interesting to explore how those identities fit into that landscape. I would say maybe the process of the decision to throw the baby out the window, and that being the logical conclusion to the situation that these people find themselves in, or that Asia and Phoebe find themselves in. And the speediness of the decision to put the baby in the handbag, that always feels, that was the initial question that I thought about, and that motivated me to write the play. So that was that instinct.